My lords, I'm pleased to announce Infernals, the most ambitious species pack to date, has a release date, the 25th of November. If you're interested and you haven't already bought the Season Pass, click the link in the description. Get ready to examine extremophile life bathing in the heat of fiery volcanic worlds. So far they're giving very little away, but we are teased with the following. There is a new Soul variant which brings the count, I believe, up to 14. If you're interested, I've covered them elsewhere. We are teased 2 new origins. The first is Cosmic Dawn, which is described as trapped as the planet's cooled, recent volcanic activity has freed some of our people. Now it is time to look for other survivors across the stars. And the second origin, Red Giant, is described as the very star that brought life to your planet has become a threat in the Red Giant origin. As it expands and overheats the star system your empire lives in, you can embrace the change or gain strength through adversity. Very vague, but potentially quite interesting. Cosmic Dawn is certainly the standout. We are also teased with 4 new civics and a special shout out to the Flaming Skull. I already love it. We're given some of the names: Fire Cult, Scorched World Heralds or Pyromaniac Instinct, Galvanic Empire, Biometallic Cartel or Galvanic Synthesis, Planet Forgers, Planetary Architects, Volcanic Nesting, and Thermal Optimizers. We're also getting a brand new player crisis called Galactic Hypothermia. The idea of this appears to be that we will set the galaxy alight in fire and flame, and in fact we actually have the first entry of an empire pursuing this path, which feels very close to home indeed. Those in the galactic community who chart the arc of history have long predicted a coming crisis, an existential threat to all sapient life which would require unprecedented unity of purpose and sacrifice to overcome, if it can be overcome at all. Popular predictions as to the nature of the crisis have been fanciful as the invasion of an extragalactic glutton, or the galaxy's machine intelligences rising up in a petty rebellion, or perhaps a war of succession spilling over from another plane of existence. But it is now clear it was always going to be us. A new way to manipulate energy will allow us to vastly increase our power. We will need to harness the fire of the stars to ignite this era. We're also teased their source of power, which appears to be crystallized entropy. This is used to upgrade the Galactic Crucible and unlock the various crisis levels. Intriguing indeed, one must wonder what sent these people down this path. Also with Infernals we shall receive Thermophile Mechanics, Infernal Species Traits, 10 new portraits, Infernal Ship Sets, the Infernal Diplomatic Room, a new city set, an advisor, flag emblems, and more. Discussing the portraits specifically, they do appear to be quite reptilian, don't they? I'm looking, are there any humanoids? There don't appear to be any humanoids. I quite like the lizard man in the gold and red armour. He looks very cool indeed. And I also like, I think, is it a tank-bound slug in sort of Dr. Octopus arms and big robotic limbs? If that's a machine portrait, I think that looks absolutely fantastic. We can also see the aliens from the trailer as well. All really exciting stuff, and I'm very much looking forward to it. However, since the Infernals announcement was fairly brief, and I've not covered the recent developer diaries, I thought this might be a good time to discuss my thoughts on the current state of the game and the last few patches we've had, really going all the way back to 4.0. The recent developer diaries, 397 to 399, have all focused on performance issues, and frankly, I think this is a really important area to address. My own experience with the game performance suggests that it is, in my eyes, in a worse state than that of pre-4.0. I can reference a specific encounter I had with Satana on a 25x crisis slider as coming as second or third, and my game practically ground to a halt when I attempted to fight and defeat her. That one single battle ended up taking about 20 to 30 minutes, and it wasn't an enjoyable experience whatsoever. I don't think I'm alone in experiencing these sorts of slowdowns post 4.0, certainly based on the comments I've been receiving and seeing the discussions that have been had on Reddit, YouTube, and Discord. But Eladrin, the Stellaris game director, does somewhat address this, and I'll read out his thoughts and then comment on them. So Eladrin states, "Performance remains the highest priority of the internal Stellaris team. A portion of the team will be fixing bugs, balance, and stability issues, especially multiplayer stability. But a dedicated sub-team from the custodians is exclusively focusing on performance. Today I'm going to go over some of our internal investigations and leads, and it is our goal to make steady progress on performance. But this is going to be a long haul and won't be a magic patch that fixes everything. We have several angles to pursue. How modifiers are applied, fleet counts, UI impacts, and economic balances are the 4 major targets under investigation. When investigating some 4.0 saves from the bug report forum, I noticed an unusually large number of ships in the late game saves, over 24,000 ships. I had the analytics team dig up some information on this and posted them on our forums earlier in the week. This compares the average number of ships in all default empires across the month of 3.14 and 4.0. The more powerful economies of 4.0 are causing us to reach previously endgame counts of ships 100 years earlier, and some less rigorous checks of saves from our overnights and those provided in the bug report forum also indicate that the 4.0 AI is much better at filling out their naval capacity and expanding it, but not nearly to the same degree that players are. The AI is not adept at stacking non-linear bonuses the way that players are, so even if it's several times as effective as it used to be, if you, the player, is 10 times as strong, it feels weaker overall. In my next investigation, I took a huge Grand Admiral game 200 years into the game and ran a series of tests, exploring how the numbers of ships in the galaxy affected the save. During these trials, I also found there was a substantial difference based on what the camera was looking at. Viewing Havenstar, the capital of the system of one of the largest empires, generally performed worse than viewing the entire galaxy map as an observer, and that itself was worse than staring at a nothingness in exploded Azalash. We're also seeing a 4.1 performance being marginally better than 3.14 until a little bit after 2300, at which point the two suddenly diverge. We're currently in the process of generating more saves and analysing the data to better understand what's happening here. These tests give us several directions to pursue, reducing the numbers of ships in the game through a combination of economic balancing and mechanical changes, and this does look like it has some promise, but we also clearly have client-side improvements to investigate. That was a large wall of text to get through. Now my thoughts. Clearly looking at these graphics, the ship counts are way higher than they previously were, and I think it's fairly obvious to me that the game economy is so out of whack with where it should be. I think back to prior to Machine Age when they did the tech nerf. Well, now we are in a significantly worse state than even pre-nerf. It's frankly ludicrous, and this partially did start with Machine Age because of virtuality empires and cosmogenesis empires. People are now hitting 100k tech numbers pre-2300 with apparent ease due to certain builds, looking at civilian builds or looking at Knights of the Toxic God, and the rest of the economy numbers aren't far behind. This, as the table suggests, means that we have almost double the numbers of ships per empire. And remember, that's mean and median for the AI. That's not taking into account the player at all, who's going to be able to output 10 or 50 or even 100 times larger numbers than the AI. Indeed, the next graphic shows that with ships removed, the game is running twice as fast. Same year, same date. Now this is obviously helpful, but it's not a solution, since ships are the most interactive part of the game. We need them, but clearly we need a lot less of them. The third graphic really highlights an issue for me, and this is the comparison between 3.14 and 4.1. Firstly, I take a small issue with the claim that the game runs better up until 2300. Looking at the graph, I'd argue that's not really worth claiming, as it's barely better, and the lines cross several times anyway. I'd also raise the massive spike in performance around 22,600. That's really odd and worth commenting on when doing a performance test. What is that massive spike? Why did it happen? And clearly that's going to have an overall effect on the averages. I assume that this graph only represents one single game, and therefore may not be reflective of the game state in general. The drastic spike around 2300 is bizarre, and it's so prominent. And the other thing to note is, why is this performance not a smooth curve? What happens around 2300 that causes this spike? Are the AIs ascending? I can't see why they would somehow puke out 100 more ships at 2300 specifically. In any case, clearly these graphics show that performance is worse. Looking at 3.14 versus 4.1, it's about 40% worse, or rather 40% longer year times, which in a game over hundreds of years really begins to add up. But they do appear to be addressing it, and I hope for the game's sake that performance returns to at least pre-4.0 levels at a minimum, and ideally I'd like to see much more performance improvements than that in the first place, given that 4.0 and the patch that came with it was certainly billed as a performance increase patch. The second performance related issue to address is the desyncs. I've personally put a halt to my own community games since the release of 4.0, partly due to the issue, although not solely due to the issue. Desyncing over and over again really isn't an enjoyable experience. Now, it's partly worse for myself because I invite players from the community who come from all across the world and have all sorts of hardware. So if you're best friend and you have similar hardware, you may not experience this issue in the same way that everybody else does. In any case, they do briefly discuss desyncs in Dev Diary 399, but they don't really cover how they're looking into it beyond the fact that they are looking into it and it's a priority. I'm happy it's being addressed, as it is a significant issue for those in the community who enjoy a multiplayer experience, but there's not much more to talk about. And that really covers what the devs are working on regarding performance, but they did also tie in these advanced ship experiments, which they're calling advanced hulls. So again, according to Aladrin, the premise of advanced ship hull experiments is to reduce the numbers of ships present in the mid to late game, and by doing so, making individual ships, especially capital ships, more effective and important. It will also give us the opportunity to reduce the late game effectiveness of the bypass meta, while still retaining a role for them. This first prototype, which we can see on screen now, intentionally goes a bit over the top on some of the numbers to make the end results more apparent. Future iterations will need balancing as they make adjustments to the economy and pacing. In Hearts of Iron 4, as technology progresses, you gain access to more effective hulls for various vehicles. These later hulls are significantly more effective than earlier variants, but you cannot upgrade directly from one to another. At some point, the antiquated vessels will become outclassed and obsolete, and you're better off scrapping them rather than maintaining them. The restructuring can be done gradually or as a major pivot, which is also reflected in Victoria 3 when you move from wooden ships to ironclads. For my initial prototype of the experiment, I've kept the same design philosophy. For simplicity, I've just called the upgraded hulls Mark II and Mark III, although this may change in the future. Currently, I've tied their unlocks to the existing technologies of improved hulls, which no longer provides other bonuses and are now available one technology tier above the original ship technology. For Mark II hulls, 2 tiers above that to a maximum of 5. So corvettes are currently available at tier 1. In this first iteration, Mark II hulls take twice as much naval capacity, but leaving their command limit unchanged. They have a multiplicative damage bonus, 25 inherent armor and shield hardening, some evasion boosts, but have 4 times the base alloy cost and upkeep. Mark III hulls once again take twice as much naval cap and deal twice as much damage as Mark II, and so on. We're currently restricting high tier reactors and computers from lower quality hulls. Currently the basic hulls can only support tier 3 reactors and computers, and the Mark II hulls can only go up to tier 4. We've discussed whether this should be a simple across the board restriction rather than being solely tied to reactors and computers, in which case the Mark II hulls would likely be able to accept tier 5 components, and the exceptional tier 6 technologies like those from Fallen Empires would require Mark III. All of this could have hooks to various civics or ascension perk, but for a first pass we're minimizing the additional complication. As shown in the above spreadsheet, the experiment also upgrades frigates a bit, granting them an inherent damage bonus to explosive weapons. All the larger ships move up 1 slot in command limit and naval capacity as part of this change. All capital ships are treated as if they were the statistical equivalent of Mark III, and Fallen Empire ships as if they were a theoretical Mark IV. These early draft numbers do make the capital ships essentially megastructures in investment, but currently ship cost modifiers are relatively common. Should the reckoning come for some of them, then we'll revisit all these costs. The Titan and Juggernaut auras are also likely to end up playing a more impactful role in this model. It's very likely that advanced hulls will end up gaining shield and armor multipliers if the experiment reaches the balancing stage, so they're not quite as hull loaded, and may also end up with reactor power multipliers, which could also potentially replace the tier limits. The current prototype does not include any changes to space fauna, bioships or crisis ships, but we've got ideas that we've discussed internally about how we'd end up doing something similar for them. So how's it gone? The AI seemed to handle the restrictions relatively well, though the alloy budgets needed to be adjusted significantly to get them building Titans and other capital ships. As expected, the AI found an immediate workaround: the Dimensional Fleet. Eladrin thus disabled the Dimensional Fleet and is running more overnights with the prototype. But after that change, Empires had around 37% as many individual ships as they did before, which is a good first step. It does not make any changes to some of the other design elements that we need to examine more closely, such as the ease of stacking cost or upkeep modifiers, and other reductions, or non-linear production bonuses that scale out of control, and is currently widely imbalanced. Naturally, any changes to this will cause us to need to revisit it. So, my thoughts on this experiment. I think it's an interesting approach, but I have reservations. I think it's all very likely to be futile unless the damage modifiers are adjusted, and even then, I'm not sure. Fleet combat, in my experience in Stellaris, specifically against high-level crisis, tends to boil down to mostly Alpha Strike, which is range and number of guns. Fighting a high-level crisis generally means your ships get one shot anyway, because of the sheer amount of damage crisis fleets can dish out. To fight these crisis events, you need lots of ships and lots of guns. To circle back to my Satana experience, I would have had around 12 to 14,000 naval cap, which is around 3,500 torpedo cruisers, against more or less one ship in Satana. That has a chance to succeed because Satana only has so many guns and she can only delete a few ships each day. Spending a huge amount of alloy on a Mark III or Mark IV hull just would not be worth it, not for the amount of damage increase that it would dish out, and certainly not for what it could take, because we assume that a high-level crisis would still just one-shot the ship anyway. Of course, that's all caveated with they may adjust the crisis ships as well. Nevertheless, I'd still be concerned that a swarm of Mark I ships would easily beat a Mark III ship. Alloy for alloy, of course. For example, if we were to take the Corvette, you could field 16 Mark I hulls versus one Mark III hull. That's 48 disruptors or lasers or whatever weapon you want to choose, versus just 3. And we assume that the Mark III won't be one-shotting the Mark Is. So, until the numbers are finalised, it's all just a big dump of speculation. But I am positive if it increases performance issues. It's likely going to be a good avenue to address. So that covers all my thoughts on the dev diaries. I'll be back on Sunday for regular scheduled programming.